interesting parallels between the gospel story that we read about the flight to Egypt and the return, and then also the story of Exodus, and then the death and resurrection of Christ, and how these things are figured in the passage that we just read. What is interesting is when you think about Egypt, what Egypt symbolizes, what it comes to symbolize in the book of Exodus is hell, basically, right? And it's a great image of hell, actually, right? Like in a spiritual sense, because it's, if you remember, after they cross the Red Sea and they're in the desert for a while, the Hebrew people are, they start complaining a lot, right? They don't have like food, and it's really rough, and so God sends them like, quail and manna, right, in the desert, splits the rock open, gives them water, does all these things, yet they continue to grumble and say, we want to go back to Egypt, right? And there's like a funny phrase that gets used called flesh pots, or it's like, it's a funny word, but they're like, oh, we want to eat the nice meat and stuff like that, back in Egypt. And so that actually describes, I think, a really good image of hell, is that hell is not pictured here as like some sort of like fire and brimstone and devils poking you in a big pot of boiling oil or something like this, right? It's like hell is tempting, right? It's fun or comfortable or pleasant to some degree, right? Like this is a really good indication of what hell is, because sin is always like that, right? It's always like it sort of allures you and sort of like seduces you in certain ways, right? And so there's something very seductive about Egypt, right? So this is a good image, and so we have to understand here also Herod is standing in and fulfilling. He is sort of a new Pharaoh in this story, and the Pharaoh in the Exodus story very clearly represents sort of the devil, or the agent of evil, right? That's trying to sort of lure people and keep people in prison. And so the Hebrew people, right, which represents the church, but really just all of humanity, or especially those people who are struggling to be freed of that. It describes hell and the sin, right, as bondage, as slavery, which is also a very good image of what sort of sin and the state of hell is that it's one of bondage and slavery, almost like someone who sort of got into too much gambling debt and then got sold into slavery to pay off their debts, and now is sort of like a debt slave or something like this. This is a very good image of how sin and sort of the oppression of sin works, because it's something that we're both complicit in, but also something that oppresses us and makes us a victim at the same time. Right? So it has this dual characteristic where everybody who's a sinner is both condemnable and also someone you can sympathize with at the same time, right? They're also like a victim and a victimizer at the same time, right? This is true when you think about maybe like abuse or even generational sins. It's like, my dad beat me. Well, why did my dad beat me and be abusive? Well, because his dad beat him, And so like a lot of times there's like these cycles, like hurt people go on to hurt other people. So these are actually, I think, quite fantastic images to help us understand these spiritual realities. And so you have in the Christ story, you have Herod is now sort of like the Pharaoh trying to gain revenge. What does, if you think about what the 10th plague was, right? In the Exodus story, what's the 10th plague? It's all the firstborn children are being are sought out and killed by the angel of death. And in this case, you have Herod, sort of this new Pharaoh, is now seeking to do what? To go kill all the firstborn children. There's all these repetitions of what's going on in Exodus, in the whole Exodus story, happen again here in the Nativity of Christ. And so you have Herod seeking out almost like to gain revenge and to go and try to exercise sort of this sort of reign of death by killing all these innocents. Yet what we see is that it fails, right? So in the Exodus story, Pharaoh loses his firstborn child, right? But in this case, God does not lose his firstborn child, even though Herod, right, the new Pharaoh, is trying to reach out and kill him, right? So we can see these parallels, but we see also key differences here, right? We see the sort of competency of God, right, and the sort of incompetency of Herod, or who represents sort of the devil, right? In this case, is not able to do that. And then you see further that where is it that Jesus, right, and his mother and Joseph and their family, they flee to? They flee back to Egypt, right? And so what this symbolically represents is Jesus and his family, right? Jesus sort of dying, going to hell, and coming back to reclaim the promised land, right? So like this flight into Egypt is a death and resurrection, right? It's back. And so what's interesting about it is it's using the realm of death, right? The kingdom of the devil, right? It's using that against him, right? And so in this reversal of sort of death, or this sort of co-opting of hell, of using the devil's own kingdom against him, is what we mean when we say Christ trampled down death by death. Right? Sort of using death itself as the very means of slaying death, right? Using the means of the devil, right, to sort of like co-opt him, right? And so you see this death and this return, and then when Herod's gone and it's safe to come back, right? They come back into the promised land. And so what we see here too is we see images of conquest where Jesus is now re-entering, right, and coming back into the promised land. So symbolically, from death back into life, to conquer the promised land, right? To turn it into the kingdom of God here. So when he comes back, we can understand the nativity as sort of the beginning of this spiritual conquest that Christ is having, where he comes in and now he's invading this world to reclaim this promised land. In the same way that the Hebrew people, when they enter the promised land themselves, they have to cleanse it, right, of all the other peoples who are there to claim it for themselves. And what this spiritually means, because this is not about genocide, but what this spiritually means is it's about removing sort of all, you can think of the promised land, right, as your own heart, but it's cleansing it and ridding it of all the sort of foreign occupiers, all the personal demons that sort of like dwell there, right, who shouldn't be, and sort of purifying it so that it can be a place that can be a paradise, it can be a promised land. And so we see this beginning of this conquest, and we see this sort of like this idea of conquest over and over again. All right, in the same way we see the theme of conquest and battle in Exodus, where you have the battle between Moses and Pharaoh, and these contests that they have, and the crossing of the Red Sea, and the Hebrew people cross through, but Pharaoh and his army, right, are drowned in it. And so we have this theme of sort of like battling between sort of like Pharaoh and his gods, and Moses and his God, and we see who wins. And so this same sort of theme of sort of conquest is continued. And the reason there's a theme of conquest is because the people of God, right, just like the Hebrew people in Egypt, are held in bondage. Right? It's like they've been kidnapped, and someone needs to come and rescue them and liberate them from this state of bondage. And when you look at the ministry of Christ that will come right after his nativity and his younger years, we see him coming in, and what does he do in his ministry? He casts out demons, he heals, right? And these two, we can see in these two things this theme of liberation. Right? That he's coming and he's liberating people from all these sort of demonic forces, all these things that oppress people and enslave them and hold them down, and he's delivering them. And we see the same thing repeated when Christ dies, harrows Hades, right? Empties it out, right? He empties Hades out the same way that the promised land is emptied out also, right? And turns what was hell into something beautiful. So there's very interesting themes here. We also have the wise men, right? We can contrast the wise men with the Pharaoh's magicians, right? Remember how you have like Aaron and Moses, and they're performing miracles, and they're, like they turn the rod into a snake, and then the Pharaoh's magicians come and they turn another rod into a snake, and then they water to blood, but eventually they get outmatched, right? In this case, we have these wise men, Herod is infuriated with them because they lie and they trick him, right? And they go by another way, so they can't be sort of manipulated by him. And so he gets bested. And so we see in this case, the wise men in this case wise up, and they side with the God who's actually winning instead of with Pharaoh this time. And so we have a lot of these themes of like reversals going on. In many ways, the nativity story, there's aspects of it that are like a reversal of what's going on in Exodus, and the Nativity in this story with Herod, and also the Exodus story, they're all pointing forward in a prophetic way towards the death and resurrection of Christ, right? And so we can kind of see these themes operating in here, and what we have is sort of, I think, the very beginnings of this liberation, which is this good news, is that like we are in bondage, right, through sin and through the consequences of other people's sins, both personally and socially in the world. Things are, they're tempting like Egypt, but it's really a hell. And the whole goal is to sort of flee and escape from, right, that land of Egypt, and to create the world and the space in our own hearts into a promised land. And that's what the Nativity story is the very beginning of. And that's how we can see connections between this particular aspect, the flight of Egypt, right, and the return, and how it connects with the Exodus story, which is always in the background for just about everything going on in the New Testament, right, that's going on. And that helps us better understand how this is all connected and building up towards, right, the death and resurrection of Christ and the Feast of Pascha. Right. Christ is born.
Glorify.